Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I thank you for hearing this testimony today and allowing us to testify. I served overseas in 2004 and 2006, and in both of my deployments overseas in combat zones, we had significant problems with mail delivery. In 2004, in the Sunni Triangle region of Iraq, we often saw times of 6 to 7 weeks both sending mail and receiving mail, so potentially 14, 15 weeks or longer, 16 weeks on someone sending you a letter and having it returned. When we were in heightened states of actual combat during the more intense parts of the war, we had absolutely no mail delivery as it was completely suspended. In 2006, I served the majority of the year in the Horn of Africa. I would often go on missions that could last months in duration, where we were completely removed from American bases with absolutely no access to mail whatsoever for many months. I was fortunate in both of my deployments to have the timing and good luck line up and was able to cast my ballot. But so too often I found that I am the exception and not the rule. Recognizing that this is a problem, those of overseas Americans who live overseas, this body took action in 2003 to institute a 60-day period by which members of the military and those deployed overseas would have access. That legislation was enhanced in 2004, providing the opportunity for overseas Americans to fax back their ballots, which is a useful thing if you have access to a fax machine. But I can tell you in every deployment I've been in, I've never even seen a fax machine, much less had access to one. We've already established through previous legislation and through general precedent that the group of people we're talking about, Americans who live abroad, whether they be military members or others, are a special group of folks who ought to be granted special consideration in having their votes counted. With that established, what we're now focusing on is what is the most effective way and what is the fairest way to help these people ensure that their vote is counted in a timely manner and a manner consistent with our democracy as a whole. According to the Secretary of State's office in 2008, general election, 84% of absentee ballots requested were received by the Secretary of State in time for the election. 2% of those were rejected. If you consider just the military and overseas portion of that California total, the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission calculates that only 67% of military and overseas ballots were received and 6% weren't counted. So what you're seeing is a 20% disparity between the absentee ballots requested and those received, between the general population as a whole and those deployed overseas. And so it's clear that the actions taken previously by this body have been well-intentioned but are still not getting to the heart of the problem, which is how do we give our folks who are living abroad the same opportunities as those who are living here to ensure those votes are cast and counted. This bill will extend the amount of time in order to receive and count overseas ballots by 21 days, provided that those ballots were cast by Election Day. This bill goes to great lengths to ensure that those Americans who are serving and fighting for our country and those who are serving in general have the same opportunity as those who are here in America. There are objections to this bill. One objection I think has great merit, and that as currently written, it doesn't apply to all overseas Americans, it just applies to members of the military. We've prepared amendments, and I'm prepared to take amendments to change this bill to ensure that the same options we're trying to provide for the Marine Corps are also provided for the Peace Corps. Because at the end of the day, the focus of this effort is ensuring that Americans who are deployed overseas, who are in difficult areas where they have a hard time accessing mail, where they have a hard time receiving it and sending it, are provided the same opportunities to ensure their votes are counted. The second objection I've heard relates to 21 days. I've been told that it's difficult, it's hard. 21 days is too long. We have 28 days to certify elections. All we're saying is that overseas ballots that come in ought to be counted not to the minimum convenient, but to the maximum possible. Because if it's your ballot and it's your vote and it shows up on day 11 or day 12 or day 13, one day past, your vote hasn't been counted, your voice hasn't been heard, despite the fact that no matter what capacity you're serving abroad, you are serving your country. And I believe we ought to do everything possible. We ought to go to every length possible to ensure that those people have a right to have their vote counted and their voice heard in elections. We have 28 days to certify an election. I think 21 days to count these ballots is reasonable. It's not that they're all going to show up on day 21. They're going to trickle in over the course of time. But I just believe fundamentally we ought to give veterans and all of those serving every opportunity, every possible day to have their votes counted. 18 other states and the District of Columbia currently have systems for counting after the election. Our bill is modeled after a successful model of Massachusetts. Massachusetts allows 21 days after the election for military ballots to be counted. They manage to conduct elections, they manage to certify elections, they manage to seat elected officials, giving not the minimum convenient, but the maximum possible. And I believe that is what our bill does. In conclusion, this bill doesn't solve the problem entirely. Nothing will. UC Berkeley's Election Administration Research Center reported that in July of 2006, California elections officials were still receiving hard copies of overseas ballots from the special election in 2005. This bill doesn't do everything to solve the problem because at the end of the day, you can't. I'll tell you anecdotally a story from being overseas as it relates to the vice chair of the committee. I've been friends with the vice chair of the committee for many years. In June of 2006, he won his election in the primary to the state assembly. I was overseas in Africa. I heard about this. I wrote him a note congratulating him on his successful win in the primary. Imagine my surprise in February of 2007, 8 months later, to walk out to the mailbox in San Diego and, to my surprise, find the letter I had written to Mr. Adams 8 months previously. I had written it. It had been sent from a military FPO in Africa. It had gone to California and gotten lost. It had got sent back to Germany. It did a trip through the Middle East. It returned to Africa. By the time it got back to Africa, I was no longer deployed in Africa, and they sent it back to my home address of record in San Diego. 8 months later, bounced all around the world many times. If that was an absentee ballot, there's nothing you can do about it 8 months later. But for somebody who comes in within a reasonable amount of time, we ought to take every action possible. I promptly took that letter to Mr. Adams. I forwarded it to his Capitol address, thinking he might find it quite amusing to see the post stamps from all over the world. It left San Diego, it arrived at the Capitol, and was promptly lost in the Capitol mail system. But the point is not lost on me, that we need to do everything possible to make sure that the votes of members of our military and those who serve us abroad are counted. I believe a 21-day period gives us the maximum amount of time possible, as demonstrated in other states, in order to make sure that we have done everything we can. This bill is supported by the American Legion, Vietnam veterans, other veterans groups, and those around the world who want to ensure that our state does everything possible to ensure that their vote is counted and their voices are heard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, would you like to close?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the committee. I know that everyone involved in this process is committed to veterans and to doing what's right and what's best for vets, and we're figuring that out. Mr. Chairman, just to your concerns, a lot of your concerns we are addressing with the amendments to make sure it applies to all people. Prior to my service in the military, I did work for an NGO, non-governmental organization, where we set up countries for elections. And so I've been to places like Cambodia and East Timor and Serbia. And I've seen the sacrifice not only that Americans make to be of service not only in the military but in other capacities, but also what it means to somebody to have a vote and to make sure their vote is counted. And so I appreciate that commitment. And Mr. Swanson, I appreciate yours as well. I believe that finding the proper balance is what we're all striving to do. 21 days was modeled on the Massachusetts system, which allowed them to have good elections, to certify them, to process them in a proper manner. But I am open to continuing the discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity to move the bill forward and continue that. So with that, members, I respectfully request an aye vote.
Okay. All right. So it's closed. Secretary, please call the roll.
Fong?
Nay.
Fong, no. Adams?
Aye.
Adams, aye. Bill Berryhill?
Aye.
Berryhill, aye. Koto?
Koto, aye.
Koto, aye. Mendoza? Saldana?
Not voting. Not speaking.
Swanson?
Swanson, aye.
Swanson, aye.
Bill passes. Bill passes. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.